The blue lights hit your rearview mirror just as you turn onto your own street. At first, you think maybe they're going past you. Then they don't. They stay right there, locked onto your bumper, creeping closer as you slow down, heart rate climbing. You signal, pull into your own driveway, thinking, at least I'm home, at least I'm safe here. But the cruiser rolls in behind you, the engine cuts, the door opens, and before you even unbuckle your seatbelt, the officer is already walking up like this stop never ended. Now ask yourself this honestly. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought the stop was basically over or under your control, but the officer suddenly took things in a completely different direction? I want you to think about that for a second, and I want you to put your answer in the comments, because what you think should happen during a traffic stop and what actually happens in the real world are often two very different things, and I'm going to explain why that gap matters more than most drivers realize. Because what happened in that scenario, being followed home and then having your car taken from your own driveway, is not just shocking. It challenges a lot of assumptions people carry around about my property, my rights, and when a police interaction actually ends. Let's break this down the way it really unfolds out there on the road. Most drivers believe there's some invisible boundary, that once you reach your home, your driveway, your private property, the rules change in your favor. You feel like you've crossed into a zone where officers have less authority. And that belief? It's one of the most dangerous misunderstandings you can carry into a real encounter. Because from the officer's perspective, the stop didn't end when you pulled into your driveway. In their mind, the stop began the moment they activated those lights. Everything that happens after that is part of one continuous interaction. And here's where it gets interesting. If an officer initiates a lawful traffic stop, let's say for speeding, a broken taillight, or even something as small as a rolling stop, they have the authority to follow through with that stop. That includes continuing the encounter even if you pull onto private property. Your driveway doesn't magically cancel their authority mid-stop. Now, does that mean they can do anything they want? No. But it does mean you don't get to reset the situation just by reaching your home. And this is where drivers start making critical mistakes. Picture this moment. You pull into your driveway, maybe a little annoyed, maybe a little nervous. The officer approaches and says something like, "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." And you're thinking, wait, this is my property. Why do I have to get out? Here's the part people don't like hearing. During a lawful traffic stop, officers can order drivers and passengers to exit the vehicle. That authority has been upheld repeatedly because of officer safety concerns. It doesn't matter if you're on the side of the road or in your driveway. If the stop is still active, that instruction still stands. And how you respond in that exact moment matters more than almost anything else. If you hesitate, argue, or challenge the instruction aggressively, the officer isn't thinking, this person knows their rights. They're thinking, this situation is escalating. And escalation changes everything. Tone shifts, body language tightens, backup might get called. What could have been a routine stop suddenly becomes a situation the officer feels they need to control more firmly. Now let's talk about the car itself being taken. This is where things get even more misunderstood. People hear, they took his car from his own driveway, and immediately think that must be illegal. But legality depends entirely on the circumstances leading up to that moment. Was the driver arrested? Was the car involved in a crime? Was there probable cause to believe the vehicle contained evidence? Was the vehicle being impounded under local policy? These are the questions that determine whether that action was lawful, not the location of the car. If, for example, the officer develops probable cause during the stop, maybe they smell alcohol, see signs of impairment, or notice something in plain view, then the situation can escalate quickly into a DUI investigation or a search scenario. And here's something drivers underestimate all the time. Officers are constantly observing. They're watching how quickly you pulled over, whether you seemed hesitant, whether you made any movements inside the vehicle before stopping, whether your hands were visible, whether your speech is clear, whether your answers are consistent. Even something as small as fumbling for your license or answering a simple question with a delayed or overly detailed response can raise suspicion. And once suspicion builds, the direction of the stop starts to change. Now imagine this variation. The officer asks, "Where are you coming from tonight?" Seems harmless, right? But this question isn't just small talk. It's a baseline test. They're listening for clarity, consistency, and confidence. If you say, just coming from a friend's house, and then later mention a restaurant, that inconsistency gets logged mentally. Not because they're trying to trap you, but because they're trained to notice patterns. And once they notice something off, they start digging. Have you had anything to drink tonight? That question comes sooner than most people expect. And here's where many drivers unintentionally make things worse. Some try to be overly cooperative and say, just one beer. They think honesty will help, but in reality, that admission gives the officer a reason to continue the investigation. Now they have a basis to ask you to step out, conduct field sobriety tests, or observe you more closely. Others go the opposite direction and become defensive. I already told you where I was. Why are you asking again? Now the officer is dealing with resistance, which again changes how they approach you. And then there's silence. Some drivers choose not to answer certain questions, which is within their rights. But here's the part that rarely gets explained clearly. How you remain silent matters just as much as the fact that you are silent. If you go silent with an attitude, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact, visible frustration, the officer may interpret that as non-cooperation or even potential concealment. But if you remain calm, respectful and composed, the same silence carries a completely different tone. This is where psychology comes into play more than law. Officers are human. They react to behavior, tone, and perceived intent. The law sets the boundaries, but the interaction itself is shaped by how both sides behave in real time. Now let's go back to the driveway scenario. You're out of the car. The officer is asking questions. Maybe they're taking longer than you expected. Maybe they're holding your license and registration while they run checks. And this is another moment where drivers start getting uneasy. Why are they taking so long? Am I being detained? Can I go inside my house? These are natural thoughts, but acting on them impulsively can backfire. If you try to walk away into your house while the stop is still ongoing, the officer may interpret that as an attempt to disengage or evade. That can escalate the situation quickly. From your perspective, you're just going inside your home. From theirs, you're leaving a lawful stop. And that difference in perspective is where problems begin. Now let's talk about something even more subtle. Passengers. If you have someone in the car with you, the dynamic changes again. Officers may ask passengers questions, sometimes the same ones they asked you. Where are you guys coming from? If your answers don't match, that inconsistency becomes another piece of the puzzle. Passengers sometimes think they're helping by jumping in, explaining things, or even joking around. But what feels like harmless conversation can complicate the situation. Because now the officer is processing multiple streams of information, looking for alignment. And when things don't align, the stop gets longer, more detailed, and more serious. Now let's circle back to the moment the car gets taken. By this point, something has usually triggered that decision. It doesn't happen out of nowhere. It might feel sudden to the driver, but from the officer's perspective, it's the result of a series of observations and decisions. Maybe the driver was arrested. Maybe the vehicle was considered evidence. Maybe it was impounded under policy. And here's the hard truth. Once it reaches that stage, arguing on the spot rarely changes the outcome. That doesn't mean you don't have rights. You absolutely do. But the roadside is not the place where those disputes get resolved. Trying to win that argument in your driveway, in that moment, often just adds tension to a situation that's already reached a critical point. What matters more is how the situation got there in the first place. Because in many cases, it's not one big mistake that leads to escalation. It's a series of small ones. A delayed pullover, a nervous or inconsistent answer, a defensive tone, a misunderstanding about what being on your property actually means. Each of those things stacks up, and by the time the situation feels out of control, it's already been building for several minutes. So what should you actually take from all this? First, understand that a traffic stop doesn't end just because you reached your driveway. If those lights came on before you parked, the interaction is still active. Second, recognize that officers are constantly observing and interpreting your behavior. Everything from your tone to your timing matters. Third, realize that your rights are real, but how and when you exercise them plays a huge role in how the situation unfolds. And finally, accept that the roadside is not the place to fight every battle. Some things get handled later, through proper channels, not in the heat of the moment with blue lights still flashing behind you. Because when you're standing in your own driveway, thinking you've reached a place of control, that's often the exact moment where people let their guard down, and that's when situations can take a turn they never expected. And once it turns, it moves fast.